Hi everybody, welcome to the webinar on supporting children through the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope you're okay today. We're going to be talking, I'm hoping, for about half an hour, 40 minutes about this topic. Do post questions if you have any, and we'll try and answer them. And the webinar will be up online, so if you're watching this later on, then you're very welcome to. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about the impact of what we're going through at the moment on all children, how they're experiencing this and how we might think about them. And then I'm going to talk about specific groups of children that might need more thinking about. We might need to draw on other resources that might be helpful. So I think there are some key issues for children, and there's been lots of chat about lots of these things. So I've seen lots of things on social media about the opportunities for development that children have when they're in lockdown, and I want to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about stress in the developing brain and the impact that might have. We're going to talk about protecting children versus keeping them informed. We're going to talk about uncertainty, and how we might navigate that path. And the tricky thing about this pandemic for everybody is that adults experiencing their own anxiety and challenges, because it's been challenging for all of us, might then need to be supporting children as well. And when I talk about these things, I'm talking both about if you're a parent and you're trying to support your children, also if you're a member of staff and you're working with children. And in the Pan Thames Paediatric Wellbeing Hub, we've been really keen to think about how we as a hub can support staff to be thinking about their jobs. But I think this is just as relevant if you don't work in paediatrics, because I think there are lots of different challenges going on. I'm just going to take a pause for a second to check that what I'm doing is going out live. It's very difficult to know that. So if somebody's watching it now, if they could message me, then that would be amazing. Otherwise, I'll carry on and we'll see how we go. I think the place that we have to start from is that children are not mini adults. So they all have different brains, and it's not like they're just a bit smaller or they know a little bit less. Actually, they're quite different. You know, they haven't yet developed the structures that we have. They have different abilities to understand, that's receptive language, and to express themselves. Also, children, even when they're young people, when they're teenagers, don't have the independence and control in many aspects of their life that we have as adults. They quite often don't have their own money, so they can't make choices about what they get and don't get. They don't have the independence about choosing what they do with their life. They need to go to school in most cases. And quite often adults will take them to places and make decisions about what's best for them. And that is right, because young people can't always weigh up the costs and the benefits of doing something and need an adult brain to help them do that. But it does mean that children and young people don't have the same control. The other thing that I think as adults we're sometimes really poor at is having this what we call mind-mindedness. What I mean by that is being able to think about what is going on in a child's head. So what they're thinking, how they're reacting. And let me give you an example of this. If one of my children knocks over, say, a vase of flowers, I'm really annoyed about that. And the fact that they were trying to help me by moving it because they didn't want to knock it over playing a game, I might know that, but I'm still cross because there's water all over my floor, maybe my flowers have got damaged, something like that. And we don't often put ourselves in the heads of the child and see that where they're coming from. Or when a child is very angry about something, we might be fed up with the fact that they're shouting. And it's quite difficult sometimes to get into their heads. And I think quite often we have that poor mind-mindedness and we act in ways that make logical sense to us. It might make sense to us not to be angry about the fact that your carrots have touched your potatoes, for example. To us, that doesn't make any sense. So we respond from that point of view. And I think that's a challenge for us. And then the final thing to think about is that as adults, our brains they do change and we do grow and learn, but they're not developing and changing in the same way. We're not growing in the same way. Children are changing all the time and are in changing environments all the time. They change from preschool to school and then to a different school. They change teachers a lot of the time. So whilst we do have changes in our adult life, the changes in children's lives are much bigger because they're changing and the world around them is changing. And all of those things are really important. So look at this image. I want to explain, this is kind of the basis for what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation. This is a picture of the neurons of children, the brain cells that are inside their brains. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the camera, I'm going to hold it up. This is what a brain cell looks like. It's got all these bits ready to make connections with other brain cells. And the way we learn is by our brain cells connecting up this one with another one and another one and another one. And in this picture, you can see that a newborn doesn't have that many connections. And as they get older, even within 1 month, their brain, it has got more brain cells and more connections. And then look at what happens in those 9 months. Compared to the newborn, a 9-month-old has so many cells and so many connections. And we know that that happens because if you think about a newborn who lies on the ground, doesn't really have any control of their arms and legs, can't feed themselves, can't look after themselves, can't communicate other than through their cries. And by 9 months, that young baby has developed the ability to probably get a spoon to their mouth, to communicate their needs very clearly, is moving around probably at that age. So the skills they've got, motor control, the skills they've developed in 9 months is astronomical. And then by 2 years, you think what they learn in 2 years, most children have got some language by 2 years. Some of them will be learning to take control of their bodily functions. They'll be feeding themselves quite well. They'll be getting their needs met in quite a different way. So look at what happens in the brain. It changes massively over time. And we also know, it's not in this picture, that there's a massive change around the teenage years as well, as those connections of brain cells readjust to a new phase in your life. And the reason I'm putting this up is because we've now been in this coronavirus lockdown for coming up 4 months, 3 months maybe. And so what's happened in a child's life in that time, that's a really significant chunk. For us, 3 or 4 months of our life is not that much. For a small child, that's a huge percentage of their life. And change will have been going on whilst they've been in the middle of this. And what we know about babies' brains is that they both need experience to develop and also develop as a result of experience. So there are some bits of the brain that only develop if given the right inputs. And then there are other bits of the brain that develop if they get input and might develop in new and different ways. And we need both of those things. We need some of the key experiences, but the more enriching experiences we have around it, the more we can grow and develop. And some of the chat that I've been seeing has been people very worried about the experiences that small children are getting in lockdown. And there's been a real mixed opinion about whether it's having an impact on the developing brain or whether being at home is good enough. And I think that both are possible. I think what small children particularly get, but older children too, when they go out of the home into other settings like preschools, nurseries or schools, is different kinds of experiences and different exposures. And sometimes those are of very good quality and that child is getting a lot out of it. Lots of children are getting that good quality at home as well. And responsive, thoughtful parents will be being able to provide development experiences for children, even if they are at home. So I think the message is to think about how children might get some of the experiences that they're missing at home. And there's a challenge on parents to do that. I think it's one of the reasons parents have been so stressed about homeschooling. Is that there's this weight, there's burden on them to provide the experiences that help their child to develop. But I also think there's reason for hope that lots of homes will be doing that in lots of different ways, not necessarily by sitting down and doing formal schooling, but there will be children who are not getting the experiences that they might need. And in particular, those will be the more vulnerable children, and I will talk about them a bit later. So I want to talk a little bit about how the body responds to stress. Although this might look like quite a complex pathway, this is what we call the fight, flight or freeze pathway. And probably most of you are quite familiar with that. something scary happens, a shot of adrenaline runs through our body, our brain goes into fight or flight, and the physiological reactions are things like breathing faster, our heart beating faster. They're a response to urgent threat. They're our body's way of trying to look after ourselves. So imagine you're standing in the middle of a very busy road. If a bus comes towards you, you are going to have this shot of adrenaline, get out the way, and your heart beating faster is helpful because it pumps blood around your body. That blood pumping around your body gets your arms and legs moving and you run out the way. And so that's what's going on for us a lot of the time. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure that I was in this response pathway quite a lot at the beginning of this crisis, when things were starting to get really scary. The number of cases were going up. We were kind of talking about lockdown, talking about closing schools. That felt really quite frightening. And for children, the same will have been happening. And sometimes we know that sometimes children are quite stressed and we can't always see it on the outside. But if you tested, looked at some of their physiological reactions, you might be able to tell that. And I suspect that there were a lot of children who were picking up on what was going on around them, even if they didn't really understand in the way that adults might have done, who were having this response to stress. And I'm going to show you this image. This is from some research that we did about what happens after a family has been in intensive care. And I'm showing it you here because I think it's a really good way of understanding what's happening to us as we go through coronavirus as well. So we had life before. Do you remember that? Life before we were in lockdown, before coronavirus was even a feature in our lives. And for children, that would have been going to school, going to nursery, having this kind of steady routine and pattern of things happening. For children with health conditions, that might have been regular checkups at the hospital, procedures or blood transfusions or whatever, but there was a normal to it. And particularly now we look back on it, we see the normalness of it, though when we were living it before, we might not have said that. It might have felt quite busy and quite stressful sometimes. But what happened in those early weeks was this massive drop in our well-being. Things went right down. It was pretty hard, that first bit. And a lot of people experienced this, well, you know, the fear. And so our well-being went from being okay, maybe in most cases, to not being so great. And then we've been in the middle of this for a while and it's been very up and down. There are some great things about being in lockdown and there are some really tough things. And there are probably more great things if you've got more privilege or more advantage. Like for me, one of the great things has been having a garden, and I'm not really sure how I would have managed without that, looking after my children and getting through this. And I think that's one of the things that I'm privileged to have, and that was one of the easier things. And in a way, this bit of the picture doesn't quite pick up what it is, because it looks like you're either good or bad. And I think there's lots of things that are both. I don't think lockdown and coronavirus has been, for some people, good or bad, but a mixture of both things, difficult and easier, and some nicer things and some harder things. But I think we've been in this, when people are in intensive care, they talk about it like a roller coaster, and I think we've been on that journey a lot. When I've had to go out to the supermarket, I've definitely felt worse. I haven't really enjoyed that bit of it very much, the queuing and the stress and the different responses of other people that have been there. When I'm sitting at home in my garden, then I probably feel a bit better and things feel a bit nicer. So we've been in this up and down thing, and we're just at the very start of coming out of this. People talk a lot at the moment about new normal, and I think this isn't normal. We're nowhere near what that is yet, because I think we've still got all of this to go. So if we are just coming out the other side of that, we're on the, things are a bit better than they were in the middle of it, but it's still quite bumpy. And it's going in a very positive upward trajectory, but getting our heads around what it's going to be like getting back to school, getting the children back into a routine, thinking about how we reinstate the routine procedures they might have been having, that's going to be quite bumpy for all of us. And staff who are working in hospitals or in schools, I'm sure are experiencing that bumpiness too, as they try and think about how they meet the needs of children. And then I think eventually we will get to new normal. We've been talking about new normal in our research for more than 10 years now. And it's really interesting how much it's entered the kind of public language in the last 3 months. I don't think we're at new normal yet. And I think it's going to be quite a long time till we're there. But I have quite a lot of hope that we will get there. This pathway that we drew, it came from talking to children and to parents. And I think all people are going to be going through some kind of pathway like this. And I think now the challenges are coping, getting through how we manage this bit of it, until we get to being able to kind of process, think about what it was like in that middle bit that I've got on my picture, and developing some sort of narrative about, so this thing happened, coronavirus hit, my school was shut for a while, I wasn't able to see my teachers and I found that quite hard and I really missed my friends. Homeschooling was a bit stressful and mummy used to shout sometimes, and I'm really pleased that I'm back at school now, and but it's hard because I've missed the whole, I've had to go up to the next year for children going back in September. So developing a story about that. And I think lots of times in the bit that we're in now, there's a harking back to, I wish life was like that before. And we tend to idealize what life was like before. Now, what's tricky about this, what's really important to remember is that even if coronavirus hadn't hit and we hadn't been through this journey that I'm showing you on the screen, the children that we're talking about would still have changed anyway, because of that thing about them being on a developmental trajectory. We will never know what their developmental trajectory might have been like had they not been through this, and they have. So that's a kind of moot point. But there's a lot of looking back at old normal and thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice? Wasn't life nice before? Wouldn't it be nice if we were there? And part of the challenge for us now is accepting that things are different, because new normal, life out on the other side of coronavirus will be different for children than it was before. And some of those things will be better and some of them will be a bit trickier. And the challenge is to accept the way that life is when it is, and that's not yet. I hope that makes sense. It's quite a lot to describe, and I can't point at all the bits for you to talk in more detail, but I think for me it makes a lot of sense about how we go through something, how we process it on the other side. And I think we're just on the other side of this now. We may, if we have another peak, go back a bit and have to kind of circle round again. So if you remember up here, there, I showed you a pathway. Now on this slide, bear with me, that pathway is the one on the right hand side, the one that says SAM acute. Okay, so we have this acute pathway shooting the adrenaline out. But given what I've just shown you about that journey that we go through, we know that there's also a chronic pathway. So that's not this kind of instant burst of adrenaline, but this stress that you're under for a longer period of time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because that pathway releases cortisol, which is our stress hormone, and that has some impacts on us. Cortisol isn't always or only a bad thing. It's the hormone that gets us up in the morning. It gives us enough of a push to go, yeah, I really need to get out of bed when it's nice and warm here, or I'm really enjoying that dream I was just having. But it does some other helpful things in moments of stress. Decreasing sensitivity to pain if you were in a very stressful situation might be quite helpful. And it does these things to look after our body in a situation where we might be out of our depth a little bit, but it also does some things that aren't so helpful. So suppressing the immune system is pretty much the last thing we would want at a time when there's a killer virus out there. And cortisol has all these impacts on our body when we're under stress. And there are different types of stress to be experiencing. And they broadly fall into these three categories. Positive stress, which is the kind of normal stuff that we're experiencing from time to time. I've got to get that piece of work in. My teacher's asking me to do this and I don't know how to do it. I'm not sure how to go and play with that group of friends. So that's the kind of thing we might be used to experiencing, mild to moderate, but we can navigate our way through it. Tolerable stress is at a higher level, but it's manageable. And that might be manageable because the grown-ups around us are helping us manage it. And the way they're helping us will depend on the age. So with small children, what adults around them, both parents and staff working with them, is they're helping them, they're talking them through it. So if you're giving a child a blood test, it might be tolerable for them if they can just say, look, this is what we're going to do, and it might feel like this, and it's going to hurt a little bit, and then this will be done. And or it might be a parent saying, oh, that's really tough that so-and-so didn't want to play with you today. Let's think about how we manage that. That might be tolerable stress. And then we get toxic stress, which is this strong, frequent or prolonged activation of that pathway on the left that I showed you, and the absence of adults being able to manage that for the child and interpret that. And it may be that the reason that's absent is because the adult is dealing with stress themselves and they aren't able to regulate the child. And we know that toxic stress is not great. Well, in fact, it's more than not great, it's bad for us. We know, if you think back to those orange images I showed you of neurons, that it actually has an impact on the way that the brain kind of grows itself and develops. It affects our physiology, so how we're responding, our behaviour, and it can affect our learning. And this is a problem because we know that later on in life, people who've been exposed to high toxic stress when they're younger, two things happen. Either they can become oversensitive to stress, so any little thing feels like a huge thing to a child, or the other thing is they can become under responsive to stress, so too much cortisol washing around can kind of dull their ability to respond to it, and both of those things are problematic. So what we need to be doing is helping children to manage the level of stress that's coming. I always say to parents when I'm working with them, your job is not to stop your child from feeling any difficulty ever. Your job is to help them navigate it when they do. And coronavirus is a perfect example of that. It's out of all our controls as parents or as people working with children. So our job, therefore, is to help them navigate through the challenges that we find ourselves in. And if you took one thing from this presentation, I think this would be a good thing to take this slide and the next one that talk about how we might do that. This circle of security, which you can find on the internet, and there's some lovely resources there, so I would really encourage you to look. It's all about how we help children to regulate, to manage what might otherwise feel quite toxic to them. And children need this safe pair of hands that's holding them, that's on the left of the picture. And that safe pair of hands is a parent, it's a teacher, it's a key worker in a nursery, it's the nurse who's looking after them potentially if they're an inpatient. I think also as staff in hospitals and in schools, we are also that secure pair of hands sometimes for parents. I'll talk about that in a minute. So children need to be able to go out and explore, but also come back and be regulated. That's the safe haven, the bottom side of the circle, to be regulated when things don't go so well. Now you see this all the time in small children, played out very clearly for you. If you go to any toddler group anywhere, you'll see children come in. I'm talking about kind of toddlers or kind of preschool age children, come in, cling to their parents to start with, they're the secure base, this is a new environment, I'm not sure about it, and then they see some inviting toys and they might do that kind of stretching where they don't quite want to leave the secure base yet, and over time they get more confident and they need the grown-up not to go, no, stay here with me, to go, yeah, go and get that toy, see what it's like. And then they need them to be keeping an eye on them. And when something happens, like somebody else snatches the toy off them, they need the grown-up to go, oh dear, that was hard, wasn't it? And grown-ups do this all the time. They do it all the time with babies, with small children, with older children. It looks different. As you get older, the children can have more courage to go away from the secure base, and they're away for longer, and they might be physically away, like they don't see their parents if they're in school all day, but they know that base is there. And other people can become the secure base for children as they get older. So that's how teachers and other key workers come in. And I think what's been really tricky for children during the pandemic is that the secure base of their school and the solidity of knowing they're there for me, whatever, suddenly schools have still been there for them, but they haven't been physically in the child's life for children who have been at home. So they've had that, the secure base has felt a bit wobbly in places. Potentially parents are feeling quite wobbly because of everything that, because of their own emotional reaction to coronavirus and then the expectations on them. And so they're left maybe not being as a secure pair of hands as they could have been before. And I think this is where some of the schools I've been working with have been really impressed with the way that they have approached communication with parents to try and communicate, we are still this secure base, we are still here being a safe pair of hands. And I think some schools have navigated that brilliantly. And so this also comes from Circle of Security, and it's 15 words to live by. So always, when we're trying to be this pair of hands, be bigger, wiser, stronger and kind. And whenever possible, you follow the child's need, but when you need to, you take charge. You say, no, this is what we're going to do now. I know that's hard for you. So we respond to children in these ways and they feel contained by us. Their big feelings, their toxic stress is being taken and saying, no, I've got this. And we're going to talk about that a bit more as we go along. So I think we need to think not just about the child on their own, but about the system that's around them. So about how much capacity the system has, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then the other issues that I think are coming up are, I've touched on this a couple of times, about homeschooling and how easy or difficult that's been for different sets of parents and different families, and returning to school. I think parents are lacking the new normal support mechanisms, the school gate conversations where you normalise, oh God, I found that really hard, how about you, are missing now for parents. The kind of things they might have done that were related to their child, like a parent-teacher committee, like some kind of community things, clubs that their children would have been going to where they would have touched base with other people. Lots of their support mechanisms are lacking. And then the parents' own support mechanisms that might be, I normally play football on a Sunday night. I'm massively missing my football team and being able to see all of them. And so the kind of things that we would have used to regulate our own stress as parents are not there at the moment. And then understandably, teachers have been stressed and anxious because teachers are people too. They may also be parents and they're coping with exactly the same pandemic that we're all coping with. And that impacts our ability, and the same with staff in hospitals have been stressed and anxious in exactly the same way. So if that's you, you're coping with your own stuff and then trying to think about how you support children and possibly how you support parents as well. That's quite a lot to be managing. And then there's all the media stuff that's going on that, you know, during the peak of the pandemic, numbers of deaths every day was being announced in every radio bulletin. So it was quite difficult to know whether to have the radio on or not have the radio on, how much you expose children to. And again, I'm going to touch on that. So if you've watched any of my previous webinars, I think I've showed this in every one I've done so far. I just really like it. I think it's such a sensible model. This idea that we've got a bucket inside us and it fills up with stress, and we can let the stress out by putting a little tap on our bucket, doing things that help to calm us down. Different things contribute to our bucket. But when we talk about this model, we talk about the idea that children have a smaller bucket and they need to tip more often into an adult's bucket. And you know that because the little thing like your carrots touching your potatoes is a big stress for a small child, say, or the fact that a friend snatched a toy off them, big thing. They kind of spill over a bit, their bucket gets too full and they have to tip some of it in. And that's when the grown-up goes, oh dear, that's really tough, isn't it? Or for an older child, it might be saying, oh, that sounds like you've had a really hard day today. That's you taking on some of the stuff for the child. But in order for us as adults, either as staff or as parents, to do that, we need to have the capacity in our own bucket. And sometimes that's been hard at the moment. And if you are an adult working with children in any way, I'd encourage you to think about how you put the tap on your bucket so you're able just to lower it enough that there's a little bit of capacity. And these are the ways that if you're working with parents, you might suggest to parents. If you're a parent yourself, these things will be helpful. The first thing is to notice how full your bucket is. You know, how stressed am I? I've been pretty stressed since I heard we had another positive patient coming in. I've been really stressed. I'm just feeling really stressed right now because I heard about this. And then take a breath. I'm saying take a breath. I think breathing is something we take for granted because we do it all the time, but actually mindfully, like thinking about it and taking a breath, we know that regulates some of the physiological reactions I was talking about earlier on. And find moments to pause. And I'm not saying that there is a lot of time at the moment, particularly if you're a parent or if you're very busy in your job, it might be difficult to find those. So do it in the loo, do it when you're getting something from a cupboard, do it when you bend down to tie your shoes up, you know, find the moments where you can. If you've got more moments than that, amazing. If you haven't, find them where you can. We know that exercise disperses cortisol, really good for that. The cortisol is that stress hormone, if you remember. So see if you can build that into your day somehow. Quite often I wear a watch that counts my steps, and since lockdown I've not been doing as many steps. You'll find me when I'm brushing my teeth trying to get a whole bunch of steps before I go to bed. So think about how you build that in a way that feels manageable. And then set boundaries for yourself. I suspect that a lot of you are finding that work is leaching into lots of aspects of your life at the moment because of a lot of remote working, because of it's felt necessary to respond quite quickly in the midst of the crisis. So now that we're on the other side of that a little bit, start to set boundaries about when you'll work and when you won't, and how you might manage the interface between work and home. And draw on your own resources. I think in the midst of a crisis, sometimes we try and use new techniques that we've never used before, but you will have got through stress before, and think about how you've done that. And then hold on to hope that there is something on the other side of this, that we will get to new normal eventually. And I really encourage you, if you're a parent or if you're a member of staff, to aim for good enough. This sheet that I've got here is from the Circle of Security stuff. You can find it on their website, but what I really like is this bit. Of course it's harder than just a whole bunch of parenting suggestions. It's harder than what I'm just talking about quite breezily on this webinar. It is harder. No one said it would be easy, and it isn't. And I'm not underestimating the challenges of any member of staff working with children and any parent, because I think they're really big at the moment. I've had to say to my children a few times, yeah, do you know that is rubbish? And there are some things about coronavirus that just are making life a bit rubbish at the moment, and acknowledging that that is tough. But doing some of these things will be worth it, because not only will it help your children, the knock-on is that it helps you as well, and it will have a positive impact in the future as well. But as they say here, the first 1,000 times are the hardest, so you just got to keep going and be consistent, and again hold on to that hope that things are going to get better. And then if you're thinking about how you might help parents to help children, I think the first thing you need to do is help them to understand that it's very normal for their child to be responding to the stress that they're experiencing in different ways. So they might be more angry, they might have more tantrums, they might be more tearful, more stroppy, they might start doing things like bedwetting or being really clingy. All of those things that are going to place an extra burden on a parent or somebody working with children, because it's an additional need to meet. But it's the way that children communicate, this is hard for me. And I think what children are showing us when they show any of those behaviours is they need a bit more. Give them extra time and attention. It will take more time, but like I said in the previous slide, the extra effort putting in will be worth it. And then listen to them, give them ways to talk about their worries and be calm about that. Think about that safe pair of hands. They're going to come to you with, this feeling feels so big and I'm overwhelmed by it. And it won't be like, I hate coronavirus. It'll be, he just took my toy, or, I don't like that my carrots touched my potato. And you're going, yeah, that sounds pretty huge. What you're doing is you're saying to them, it feels like it's this big. I hope you can see my hands. I'm not sure the width of the webcam. Feels like it's this big. It's okay, we can manage it. And you're packaging it for them. And that, if you do that over and over again, you're giving children an understanding, feeling feels this big. Okay, it's okay. And that's children learning to regulate, and they learn that through you regulating for them. And then find chances to be together and to play and relax. There are some advantages about being at home more, to have more opportunities to do that, because we're not rushing off to lots of different things. Keep a regular routine, it's really important. It's the same for us as workers, that includes time for playing and time for learning. And then give them facts about what's happening. I'm going to talk about how we might talk about difficult things a bit later on. And then older children might need a better way of understanding what's going on for them. In a recent survey of mental health, since we've been in the midst of the pandemic, teenagers are coming out as a group that are struggling more. And I like this model. I think it makes sense to lots of young people. This idea that there are 3 systems inside us. The drive system is the blue one, the soothing system is the green one, which is what helps us manage stress, and the threat system is the red one. And sometimes one of those gets bigger than another. If you imagine them like 3 balloons, sometimes one balloon gets more air in, and possibly some of the air goes out of one of the others. And at the moment, particularly at the beginning, and I think to a degree now, although I think it's less now, the red balloon got huge. Our blue balloon for some young people particularly went down. They've suddenly been told, well, we're going to cancel your exams, or you can't come into school anymore. So the drive, the kind of motivation to do something was less, and the opportunities for soothing that they might normally have had, going out to see their friends, chatting in the lunch hall, all of those things are less. So the red balloon got huge and the other 2 got a bit smaller. And the challenge with young people is helping them to get their balloons in balance. There's a brilliant video on YouTube about this called Compassion for Voices, and it shows these 3 circles inside the person and how they get bigger and smaller as different things go on. So I'd encourage, if you've got a young person, a teenager or even a young adult, that this might be a good place for them to look. So I think as anybody working with children or parenting them, what we need to be doing is giving children strategies. Like I said earlier, it's not our job to kind of wrap them in cotton wool and protect them from everything. It's our job to help them find a way through this and to regulate that for them. So it might be helping them to learn about breathing using balloons or using bubbles. It might be giving them a mantra. This is a kind of little saying on a card that says, I'm going to get through this. I keep in my drawer, I think I showed them in a different webinar, these little laminated, I've just laminated a load of Post-it notes, and I might give a young person these, and we might write on them in a Sharpie that says, I'm going to get through this, or I can be calm, or I can, on the other side, life's going to be okay. that kind of thing. So they have a mantra, that's something they say to themselves when things feel like they're getting stressed. And approaches that we might use with children, if we're staff working with children, we might formulating means helping them to understand why things are difficult. So, gosh, it sounds like you've been really stressed today. I wonder if you've been feeling a bit worried about going back to school. So that would be formulating for the child, making sense of their experience for them. And naming their feelings is really important, because that helps children to understand them. It looks like you're feeling really angry today, or it looks like you're really nervous. And normalizing them, that it's really okay to feel that way at the moment, and that you might feel up and down, and giving them space to talk about it, to write and draw, not in a way that feels pressured, but in a way that gives them the options. So that's a kind of overview about how we might need to think about children. I'm going to just spend a little bit of time now thinking about which groups of children might need additional considerations. I think these are some of the key groups. I mentioned them at the beginning. Children who for some health reason might have more issues around the time of the pandemic, children who've been bereaved, children of key workers, I think, are a vulnerable group, children from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, and children who might have been vulnerable anyway and there might be more of an impact on them at the moment. So in terms of children with health conditions, we know that there's been an impact on healthcare of the coronavirus pandemic on other conditions, like not being able to go in for outpatient appointments, like families feeling very anxious about attending hospital for things like their regular blood transfusions or other regular treatment. So that's a big issue. Then we know that lockdown will have had an impact on some people's conditions. If exercising regularly was part of your managing your blood sugars, say with diabetes, then a lockdown is going to have had an impact on that if you haven't been able to do that. And then fear and anxiety. There are lots of conditions in which fear and anxiety and stress increase the risks for us, or increase the presentation of symptoms. Asthma is a good example of that, or in allergy, we know children are more vulnerable if they're more stressed. So there are ways in which COVID will have impacted on their condition. And then they might be worried about the impact of COVID on their condition and how they might be more vulnerable in that way, and which links very well to children who are shielding, either because of themselves or because of somebody in their family. And the fear and anxiety in those families will be much higher. I think, as we know, lots of parents feel very anxious anyway. And if you've then got a child or a partner who you think might be more at risk of coronavirus were they to catch it, then your fear and anxiety is understandably going to be much higher. And the impact on the child and the other siblings is huge. I think for these families, the importance of hope is really, really important for us to share with families, that there will be something on the other side of this, and getting through this is really important. And there's another webinar called Getting Through It, which helps people to think about how they might get through the tough times. I think children who are from Black and ethnic minority communities really deserve some thinking about. Now, I wrote this presentation before George Floyd was killed, and it feels even more important to talk about now, but it felt important before. And I think let's not forget that even before what happened recently, there was already these ongoing micro and macro aggressions being experienced by young people, feeling ignored, unheard, or actively disliked and experiencing racism. And we know that racism has been increasing, and this kind of marginalisation of some groups. And in addition to that, then we knew that coronavirus is having a disproportionate impact on adults from their communities. So take that all into account anyway. And then we have the recent events and the Black Lives Matter movement, and it both provides empowerment and challenge for young people who are from these communities and those who aren't. And I think some of the challenges are how you talk about this in your families and how it might be managed in schools. And I think both of those are challenges that as parents and as people working with children, we need to grapple with. And here are some of the things that I think are really important. What we know is shying away from the issues, not talking about them, doesn't help. Providing a total media blackout doesn't help. If this is something you'd really like to know more about, I would really encourage you to look at this, Talking to Your Children About Scary World News, which is from the Mental Health Foundation, because I think it gives some really clear guidance about how we might talk about this stuff. So find out what the child does know, or they've surmised from what they've heard, and name and acknowledge some of the fear and anxiety, and provide a space to talk about it. If you need to, because you're not sure how to talk with some children about that, use supervision, go and find other people who you can talk it through with. And you might need to name your own discomfort or concern. I feel, as a white person in the middle of this, really struggling to know how I can be most helpful and how I can say something without being unhelpful or not acknowledging that I come from a position of white privilege. And I think naming some of that is really important. So I think you need to be respectful and thoughtful and prepared to get it wrong sometimes and open to the conversation. And I think one of the challenges is finding your way through that discussion. And what I'm trying to do is arm myself with some knowledge about the issues that I hope will be useful going forward. I've just read a brilliant book called Biased, which is by a researcher in racial bias, and that's really helped me to understand more of the issues more. So I think if you're a member of staff and you're interested in this, go out and find more things that will equip you better. I think bereaved children are a really important group to think about. I haven't spent a lot of time on this presentation thinking about them because we've done a whole webinar about bereavement that applies to children just as much to adults. But I think we need to acknowledge there are losses, whether a child has experienced the death of somebody, of holidays, of schools, of birthday parties. For adults, we've lost things like training that we might have done, courses, again, holidays. With children as well as adults have lost the face-to-face contact that we used to take for granted. And then there will be children who've lost someone, as in someone's died, and they may have very little time to process it because the context is changing all the time, like they might be returning to school now, for example, or thinking about the next steps. And we know that how grief is played out depends on lots of things, both the relationship and the circumstance of death, which might be more difficult at the moment. They might not have been able to attend a funeral because funeral numbers are very limited at the moment. The environment around them, which might be higher stress than normal, and the kind of person that they are anyway. And Child Bereavement UK has some brilliant resources. If you're a teacher or a member of staff and you're working with bereaved children, I really encourage you to look at some of their webinars. So here are the key things I think you need to think about. With children who are bereaved, we talk a lot about puddle jumping. This is this idea that they might be really distressed 1 minute and the next minute say, can I go and play? Or you might tell them, you might break the news of somebody's death to them and they might go, okay, can I watch TV now? And that's the idea about puddle jumping. It doesn't mean they're not upset or they're uncaring. It doesn't necessarily mean they haven't understood. That's the way that children process things like this. So what we need to do as adults is give them lots of invitations to talk about it, but we don't have to push it. So we don't avoid talking about death or loss. And we use those words, death, rather than things like loss or gone away, want to sleep, because they help children to understand. But we might need to be consistent and repeat it quite a lot. And then we need to be human, be in touch with the emotion that is experiencing. And I think sometimes that's easier. And sometimes as staff, we might try and protect ourselves, and we've got to kind of navigate both. And then I think my last group is thinking about vulnerable children. These are the children maybe on a child in need plan or a child protection plan. Maybe they're on the edge of care. Maybe they're just a family that you were quite concerned about, where life was already tough for them. Maybe they weren't attending school all of the time. Maybe they weren't coming to appointments at the hospital. And lockdown will have made life tougher for them. And we know that domestic violence, the rates of that have gone up, that safeguarding referrals went down. And I would hypothesise that's because we've had less eyes on children. So normally there might be hospital staff seeing children and school staff seeing them very regularly. And some of that hasn't been happening. And that's difficult for families. And then I think there are also issues around poverty and deprivation, around access to education. We already know that children from poorer backgrounds are less likely to have accessed the same amount of education as children from more well-off backgrounds. And there's also the issues around children's early start in life, thinking about that safe pair of hands. Some families will be more able, have more capacity to be able to be steady. If lots of other things in your life are unsteady as a parent, being that steady pair of hands is more difficult. And therefore, your child may not yet have learnt to regulate or to see you as a safe base or have a steady idea about that. That may impact on the child's ability to access future attachment relationships in a secure way, and that makes it more difficult for those families. So I think for those families, we need to think about how we help them to do these kind of solid 5 principles, which again is in the Getting Through It webinar if you want to know more about it. But it's about helping them to feel safe and calm, to connect with the support they already have, and where they can exercise some control to do it, and to have hope that we will come through the other side of this. And I think those vulnerable families will need a lot more of that, and a lot more scaffolding around that. I think I've mentioned this earlier, but I'd really encourage you to think about how you help children develop a story about what's happened. And there are lots of beautiful resources out there that will help. Well, these are ones that are all freely available on the internet. And some of them are storybooks, and some of them are books that a child might work through. The COVID time capsule is a lovely one that the child might contribute to, particularly a kind of upper primary, maybe possibly lower secondary might be interested to do. But I think it's relevant for younger children too. And then I want to end by giving you some hope about this. I think there are lots of things to be holding in mind and to be thinking about and to be concerned about for children. But I'd like to encourage you to think about this pyramid, which comes from Child Bereavement UK, but it's really relevant in this setting, that children, most children will recover with a response from their existing supported networks. So they will come back to school, and it might feel wobbly for a while and will need to be all those things solid and consistent, but they're going to get this response, this caring, supportive, general response that is available to all children. Some children and families are going to need a bit more, and that might be the homeschool link worker in your school, some ELSA support, it might be some additional nurse sessions if they're under a hospital, it might be some groups, they might need something extra to just help them to navigate processing what they've been through and coming out the other side. And then there will be a few children who will need specialist support, who might be particularly vulnerable, particularly traumatised by what's gone on, possibly bereaved, and they might need specialist support from that. And organisations will be thinking and will continue to think about how that's available. And I think the challenge for staff is finding the ways to access that in exactly the same way as staff. We're navigating how we might access that if that's us too. And I want to end with a note about, I've been talking a lot about children, but if you're working with children or parenting them in any capacity, that looking after yourself is vital if you're going to do all of the things I've talked about. So if you remembered something about that, remember this: keep calm, stay wise, be kind, as a kind of grounding for you, a solid pair of hands for you. Take a breath, focus on what really matters, make wise choices and take the time to think about what is the wise choice, and then be kind. Lots of people are going through lots of different things. I've seen this really nice quote recently about how we're all in the same storm but we're in different boats. And I think be kind, because we don't know what's going on in other people's boats. And you'll know if you've watched any of my other webinars that I think Charlie McKesey is just brilliant. I think he's just really caught, well, I think even before this, he'd caught the mood of the nation, but I think what he's saying here is really helpful. And I chose this one to put up today because I saw on Charlie McKesey's Twitter feed that a nurse had put up, actually I've got this as my screensaver at the moment, it says, if you can't read the bottom bit, we're out of our depth, said the boy, just breathe, said the horse, and keep swimming. And I think that's what we need to do for now. We need to get through, think about that graph, and we're just making our way through till we get to the other side. And finally, here's a bunch of resources that might be really helpful for you. All of them are freely available on the internet. If you're working with children and their key workers, there's a really nice booklet for them that they might be able to read. There's some really helpful things about talking to children about illness and talking to them about news, and then some other advice and guidance. So the one from the healthcare toolbox is this: helping my child to cope, and it includes, if you're a healthcare practitioner, about helping children with existing health conditions. It's a really useful sheet. So I'm sorry I've talked longer than I said I was going to. I hope this has been helpful to you. Do let us know if there's anything you'd like us to cover. Thank you very much.